Marine Scout sniper Tyler Banks had been in position for 11 hours. Banks's body ached. Banks's eyes burned from staring through the scope. But Banks stayed still, stayed focused, because that's what snipers do. They wait. They watch. They take the shot when it matters. What Banks didn't know was that in exactly 47 seconds, Banks would face an impossible choice. 1 bullet left in Banks's rifle, 2 targets in Banks's scope, 3 seconds to decide. And the wrong choice would haunt Banks for the rest of Banks's life. But here's what no one tells you about impossible choices. Sometimes there is no right answer. Sometimes you can only choose which nightmare you'll live with forever. Banks was positioned on a rooftop overlooking a marketplace in Kandahar. Intelligence had warned of a planned bombing, large civilian gathering, high casualties expected. Banks's mission was simple: identify the bomber, eliminate the threat, save lives. Banks's spotter, Corporal Lawson, lay beside Banks. Lawson scanned the crowd through binoculars. Lawson whispered to Banks, "Got a lot of people down there. Women, kids. If this bomb goes off, it's going to be a massacre." Banks said quietly to Lawson, "Then we make sure it doesn't go off." They'd been watching for hours. The marketplace was busy. Normal. People buying food, children playing, no obvious threats. But Banks had learned to trust his instincts. Something felt wrong. The crowd's energy was off. Too tense, too watchful. Then Banks saw him, a man in traditional clothing, moving through the crowd with purpose. The man's hand kept going to the man's chest, checking something. The man was sweating despite the cool morning air. Classic signs of a suicide bomber. Banks centered the scope on the man. Banks said to Lawson, "Target identified. Male. Brown vest. Northwest corner of the market. He's wearing the vest." Lawson confirmed. Lawson said to Banks, "I see him. Clear shot?" Banks checked the angles. Wind speed, distance, civilians in the background. Banks said to Lawson, "Not clean. Too many people behind him. If I miss or the round overpenetrates, I could hit bystanders." Lawson said to Banks, "We wait for a better angle." They watched the bomber move through the crowd. The man was heading toward the center of the market, where the density was highest, where maximum casualties would occur. Banks tracked the man, waiting for the moment, the clear shot. Then everything changed. Banks saw movement, American uniforms, a patrol entering the marketplace. 4 soldiers, standard security sweep. They had no idea a bomber was in the crowd. No idea they were walking into a kill zone. Banks's heart rate elevated. Banks said to Lawson, "We've got friendlies in the market. 4-man team, southeast entrance." Lawson said to Banks, "Does command know they're there?" Banks checked the radio. Static. The patrol wasn't on their frequency. Different unit, different command structure. No way to warn them. The bomber saw the American patrol. The man's hand moved to the man's vest, to the detonator. The man was going to blow himself up. Now, while American soldiers and dozens of civilians were in the kill radius. Banks said to Lawson urgently, "He's going for the trigger. I need to take the shot." But as Banks prepared to fire, one of the American soldiers stepped into Banks's line of sight, between Banks and the bomber. Perfect obstruction. Banks couldn't take the shot without hitting the soldier. Banks said to Lawson, "Blocked. I don't have the shot." The soldier in Banks's scope seemed to notice something. The soldier turned, looked directly at the bomber. Recognition flashed across the soldier's face. The soldier started moving toward the bomber. Fast, aggressive. The bomber saw the soldier coming. The bomber's hand moved to the detonator. Seconds from detonation. Banks made a split-second decision. Banks shifted aim. Banks fired. The shot was true. The round caught the bomber's center mass. The man dropped. Dead before hitting the ground. The detonator fell from the man's hand, unexploded. Crisis averted. Threat neutralized. Dozens of lives saved. Banks let out a breath. Banks said to Lawson, "Target down. Bomber eliminated." But then Banks saw something that made Banks's blood run cold. The American soldier who'd been moving toward the bomber turned, looked directly at Banks's position. The soldier's face was visible through the scope now. Young, maybe 22, and terrified. The soldier started waving, frantically, desperately, trying to signal something. Banks said to Lawson, "What's he doing? Why is he signaling us?" Lawson looked through binoculars. Lawson's voice changed. Lawson said to Banks, "Oh God." "Banks, look at his vest." Banks shifted the scope, focused on the soldier's body armor, saw what Lawson had seen. Wires, barely visible, running from the soldier's vest down to the soldier's belt. The soldier was wearing a suicide vest, under the uniform. Banks said to Lawson, "That's not possible. That's an American soldier." Lawson said to Banks, his voice shaking, "He's waving us off. He's trying to warn us." "Banks, I think he's trying to tell us to shoot him." Banks's mind couldn't process it. An American soldier, wearing American uniform, carrying American weapons, but wired with explosives like a suicide bomber. It made no sense. Unless Banks remembered the intelligence briefing from 2 weeks ago. A soldier had gone missing. Private Danny Walsh disappeared during a patrol in Helmand Province, presumed captured by Taliban. There'd been a search, no body found, no ransom demands. Walsh had simply vanished. Banks looked at the soldier's face through the scope, compared it to the mental image Banks had of Walsh's file photo. Similar build, similar features, but the eyes were different, haunted, broken. Banks said to Lawson, "That's Walsh, Private Danny Walsh. He's been missing for 2 weeks. Before we continue this story, I need to know who's watching. Drop your name and city in the comments right now. Let's see where in the world this story is reaching." Lawson said to Banks, "If that's Walsh, then the Taliban sent him back. They turned him into a weapon. They're using him to attack his own people." Banks watched Walsh through the scope. Walsh was still waving, still trying to signal. Walsh's mouth was moving, saying something. Banks couldn't hear the words, but Banks could read Walsh's lips. "Shoot me. Please, shoot me." Banks's hands started shaking. Banks said to Lawson, "He wants us to kill him. He knows what they've done to him. He's trying to stop them from using him." Lawson said to Banks, "Can you disarm the vest from here?" Banks looked at the wiring. Complex, professional, military-grade explosive work. Banks said to Lawson, "No, it's too sophisticated. Even if I hit the detonator, it might trigger the blast. The only safe shot is center mass. Kill him instantly. Brain shuts down before he can trigger anything." Lawson said to Banks, "Banks, that's an American soldier. That's one of ours." Banks said to Lawson, "I know, but if we don't take the shot, the Taliban will detonate him remotely. They'll kill everyone in that market, including our patrol." As if confirming Banks's words, the marketplace erupted in gunfire. Insurgents had been hidden in the crowd, waiting. They opened fire on the American patrol. The trap was sprung. The patrol took cover, returned fire. Civilians screamed, ran. Chaos erupted, and Walsh stood in the middle of it all, not moving, not fighting, just standing, waiting to be detonated. A human bomb in the center of a massacre. Banks had 1 round left. Banks had loaded light for this mission. Expected 1 shot, 1 kill. Hadn't anticipated needing more. Now Banks had to choose. Take the shot. Kill Walsh. Save everyone else in the market. Execute an American soldier to prevent mass casualties. Or don't shoot. Hope someone could reach Walsh, disarm him, save him, and risk the Taliban detonating the vest remotely, killing Walsh and everyone around him. 3 seconds to decide. Banks thought about Walsh's family, the parents who'd already mourned him as missing. Who might get closure if Walsh's body came home? Or who might have to live with the knowledge their son died as a suicide bomber? Banks thought about the civilians in the market, the children, the families, the innocent people who'd done nothing except be in the wrong place. Banks thought about the American patrol, 4 soldiers fighting for their lives, trusting that Overwatch would protect them. Banks made the hardest decision of Banks's life. Banks said to Lawson quietly, "Forgive me." Banks pulled the trigger. The round traveled 800 meters in under 2 seconds, struck Walsh exactly where Banks aimed. Center mass, heart shot, instant death. Walsh dropped. The vest didn't detonate. Whatever remote trigger the Taliban had, they didn't use it. Maybe they couldn't get signal. Maybe they were too surprised. Maybe Walsh had done something to disable it before he'd entered the market. The firefight continued. The American patrol fought their way out. The civilians scattered. The insurgents melted into the crowd. Within 5 minutes, it was over. Banks and Lawson packed their gear, prepared to exfiltrate. Standard procedure: get off the rooftop before enemy forces could triangulate their position. But Banks moved mechanically. Banks's mind was stuck on that moment, on Walsh's face, on the split second before Banks pulled the trigger, on Walsh's lips forming the words, "Thank you." Back at base, Banks gave his report. Command listened, confirmed the kill, confirmed Walsh's identity through fingerprints taken from the body, confirmed the suicide vest, 20 pounds of C4, enough to level the marketplace. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Pierce, called Banks into Pierce's office. Pierce said to Banks, "You did the right thing, Corporal. You saved lives, American lives and civilian lives. Your actions today prevented a catastrophe." Banks said to Pierce, "Sir, I killed an American soldier." Pierce said to Banks, "You killed a weapon. Walsh died 2 weeks ago when the Taliban captured him. What you shot today was just his body. The man was already gone." But Banks knew that wasn't true. Banks had seen Walsh's eyes, had seen the awareness, the consciousness, the desperate plea. Walsh had been alive, trapped in his own body, used as a weapon against his own people, and Banks had been the one to end it. Pierce continued. Pierce said to Banks, "There will be an investigation, standard procedure for any American casualty. But the evidence is clear. You made the right call. You'll be cleared." Banks was cleared. The investigation confirmed everything. Walsh had been captured, brainwashed, wired with explosives, sent back as a human bomb. Banks's action had prevented mass casualties. It was clean, justified, heroic even. But Banks didn't feel like a hero. Banks felt like an executioner. The nightmare started immediately. Every night, Banks saw Walsh's face, saw the moment of impact, saw Walsh fall. Sometimes in the dreams, Banks missed. The vest detonated. Everyone died. Sometimes in the dreams, Banks didn't shoot. Someone else saved Walsh. Disarmed the vest. Walsh went home. But reality was unchangeable. Banks had made the choice, had pulled the trigger, had killed Danny Walsh. 3 weeks later, Banks received a letter, forwarded through command, from Walsh's parents. Banks almost didn't open it. Banks didn't want to face their grief, their anger, their accusations. But Banks owed them that much. Banks opened the letter, read it. The letter wasn't angry, wasn't accusatory. It thanked Banks. Walsh's parents wrote that they'd been briefed on what happened, that they understood Walsh had been used as a weapon, that Banks had given their son mercy, had ended Walsh's suffering, had prevented Walsh from being used to kill innocent people. They wrote that they were grateful, that knowing Walsh's last conscious act was trying to save others gave them comfort, that Banks had honored their son by making the hardest choice. They didn't blame Banks. They thanked Banks. Banks read the letter 3 times, cried for the first time since the shooting, not from relief, from the weight of understanding what Banks had done. Banks hadn't just killed an enemy. Banks had granted mercy to a fellow soldier, had ended a nightmare the only way possible. If this story's affecting you, hit that like button and subscribe. And let me know in the comments your name and where you're from. These stories need to be heard. These sacrifices need to be remembered. Banks kept the letter, carried it through the rest of Banks's deployment, through 2 more years of service, through the transition back to civilian life. The letter was Banks's anchor, proof that Banks had done the right thing, even when the right thing felt like murder. Years later, Banks would attend Walsh's memorial service. The family had waited years for closure, for Walsh's body to be identified and returned, for the full story to be declassified. When it finally was, they held a proper funeral, military honors, flag ceremony, the recognition Walsh deserved. Banks attended in dress uniform, stood at the back, didn't want to intrude on the family's grief. But Walsh's mother saw Banks, walked over, looked at Banks with eyes that had cried too many tears. She said to Banks, "You're him, the sniper, the one who saved all those people." Banks said to her, "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. Your son was a hero. What happened to him?" She interrupted. She said to Banks, "You gave him peace. That's what you did. Danny was trapped, tortured, used, and you freed him. You let him die a soldier instead of a weapon. Thank you for that." She hugged Banks, this woman who'd lost her son, who'd waited years for answers, who had every right to hate Banks. She hugged Banks and thanked Banks for killing her child. Banks broke down. All the guilt, all the pain, all the nightmare, they poured out in that moment. Walsh's mother held Banks. Let Banks cry. Two people destroyed by the same tragedy, finding comfort in shared grief. After the service, Banks met Walsh's unit. The soldiers who'd served with Walsh, who'd searched for Walsh, who'd mourned Walsh. They told Banks stories about who Walsh was. The kid from Ohio who loved baseball, who sent half his pay home to his mother, who wanted to be a teacher when he got out. They told Banks what the investigation had revealed, that Walsh had been captured, held in a Taliban compound, subjected to psychological torture for 2 weeks, brainwashed using drugs and sleep deprivation, convinced that American forces had abandoned him, that his only purpose was to strike back. But part of Walsh had resisted, the part that made Walsh enter the marketplace and start waving, the part that tried to warn Banks, the part that said, "Thank you," as Banks pulled the trigger. Walsh had fought the programming until the very end, had chosen to save lives instead of take them. Banks learned that Walsh had disabled the remote detonator himself, had sabotaged it during transport to the market. The Taliban thought they could detonate Walsh remotely if Walsh didn't do it himself. But Walsh had made sure that wouldn't work, had given Banks the opportunity to end it cleanly. Walsh's last act had been one of defiance, of choosing death over becoming a murderer, and Banks had been the instrument of that choice. Understanding that didn't make it easier, didn't erase the nightmares, didn't change what Banks had done, but it gave context, gave meaning, turned an execution into an act of mercy. Banks left the military 2 years later, honorably discharged, decorated for the marketplace action. But Banks never felt comfortable with the recognition, never felt like a hero. Heroes save people. Banks had killed someone, but Banks had also prevented a massacre, had saved dozens of lives, had honored a fellow soldier's sacrifice. That complexity was something Banks had to live with. Banks became a counselor, worked with veterans dealing with PTSD, helped soldiers process trauma, used Banks's own experience to guide others through their darkness. It was Banks's way of giving back, of turning the worst moment of Banks's life into something that could help others. Banks never forgot Walsh, never stopped seeing that face in the scope, never stopped hearing that silent plea, "Shoot me, please." But Banks also never forgot what Walsh's mother had said. "You gave him peace." That's what Banks held on to, in the darkest moments, when the nightmares were worst, when the guilt threatened to consume Banks. The knowledge that Banks had done what Walsh wanted, had freed Walsh from being used as a weapon, had let Walsh die as a soldier. One shot, one bullet, one impossible choice. Banks made it, lived with it, carried it every day. And Banks honored it by helping others carry their own impossible burdens, by being proof that you can survive the hardest decisions, that you can live with doing something terrible for the right reasons, that mercy sometimes looks like violence, that saving lives sometimes requires taking one. Banks would tell other veterans, war forces impossible choices. makes you the instrument of tragedy, makes you responsible for decisions no human should have to make. But surviving those decisions doesn't make you a monster. Living with the guilt doesn't make you weak. Continuing to serve, to help, to honor the sacrifice, that's what makes you a soldier. Danny Walsh died in a marketplace in Kandahar, not as a bomber, not as an enemy, but as a soldier who fought his programming until the very end, who chose mercy over murder, who trusted a fellow Marine to do what needed to be done. And Tyler Banks lived with the burden of granting that mercy, of being the one who pulled the trigger, of carrying Walsh's last moments forever. That's the weight snipers carry, not just the weapon, not just the mission, but the lives they take, the choices they make, the impossible decisions that haunt them forever. Banks made the right choice that day, saved lives, prevented catastrophe, honored a brother's sacrifice. But right and easy are not the same thing, and Banks would spend the rest of Banks's life learning to live with the difference. One shot, one soldier, one mercy. That was enough. It had to be enough.